All right, let's get going with today's React snack. It's all about fetching data from a public API. So what we're going to be doing is hitting an API endpoint. It's called Ball Don't Lie. It's just got a bunch of data on the NBA and its teams and things like that. You can check it out. We're just going to be hitting the endpoint that gives us a list of teams. So if I actually go to this address right now, this is everything that we're actually going to be pulling from, and this is the address that we're going to be hitting. So you can see it gives us this data array with a bunch of information about the different teams in the NBA. So in order to get this going, right now we have just a hard-coded list of teams, and what we want to do is, instead of hard-coding this, we want to populate this unordered list with the names of the teams from that endpoint that I just showed you. So how we're going to do that? First, at the top, you're going to want to import useEffect and useState. These are two things that we're going to be using, two React hooks that we're going to be using inside of this component to get everything set up. Next, inside of your component, we're going to set a team variable, and we're going to set it up as a useState hook to an empty array. So I'll show that and then kind of explain what's going on. So we have const teams and set teams, useState, we'll have an empty array. So basically, this is creating a variable called teams and setting it to an empty array. It's also providing us a way to update this state with this setTeams method here. So we'll come back to each of these. You're seeing that I'm getting a bunch of errors here. It's because I'm not using the useEffect or teams or setTeams yet, but we will in just a little bit. So we'll come back to this set of variables in just a little bit. So to actually make our call to the endpoint, we're going to create a useEffect hook. And we're going to, inside of this useEffect hook, we're going to make a function called getData. You can call that whatever you want. I'm just calling it getData because that's what we're doing. We're going to make this an asynchronous function. And now, so it's basically just like, like a regular fat arrow function. Like that, but you just pop async in front of the parentheses. Now, in order to use an asynchronous function, you need to have await on the inside. So what we're going to do is we're going to set up a variable called response. And we'll await fetch of that endpoint that we looked at just a minute ago. So to kind of break down what's going on so far, we have this useEffect hook. useEffect hook is going to run anytime the component re-renders, which I'm going to show you something that we need to do before in just a second. Then inside of this hook, we have this function that gets called. It's called getData, and it's going to go give us this response where it's fetching data from this API here. So fetch I did not make up. That's built in. That's a JavaScript native API, the fetch API. You could use something like Axios if you wanted to as well. I like fetch because you don't have to install anything, but whatever you prefer is fine. So if we await that fetch and then console log our response, we'll see what we get as long as we on the inside of this useEffect hook, we actually call getData. So there we go. We got our response. We can see the URL that it came from and some other information. Now, I mentioned earlier we need to do something with our useEffect hook. Let's say that you had like a form on this page or anything that was dynamic that was updating state and triggering a re-render. What would happen is every time that any component on this on this app component re-rendered, this useEffect hook would trigger the getData function. And so basically what would happen is you'd be hitting this endpoint over and over and over and over again, which you don't want to or need to do, especially if you're working with an endpoint where you're getting charged for every time that it gets hit. You don't want to do that. So how we avoid that in a use effect hook is if you go to the very end where the closing curly brace in parentheses is, you just put an empty array. And what that does is basically treats the use effect hook as a like run it once and then don't worry about it anymore. So once your component mounts, it's going to run this whatever's on the inside, and then it's going to be done. And so this is a good way of using the use effect hook to pull data from an API because you only want to do it once. I got another video on the use effect hook. If you want to check that out, I go into a little bit more detail about some other stuff that you can do with this array here. It's called a dependency array, or you can just check it out on your own. So we've got our response. That hasn't really given us anything super useful yet. So next step, we'll have our JSON, and that's going to take our response .json, and now let's take a look at what we're getting here. So now it's refreshing, and now we're getting some data. So that sounds like it's good. We're heading in the right direction. So this is just an object with some data and then some other information here that we don't need. So what we can do here, just again to kind of go the next step, is we'll say const data equals JSON. So data is a new variable that I'm creating just because it's going to be holding the data that we want. JSON is making reference to this variable here. And remember, since this was an object that we got with data and meta, we want data because here's all of our nice information about the NBA teams. So what we'll do, object dot notation, so we'll do JSON dot data. And then we'll console log that data and see what we get. Oh my goodness, what is going on? There we go. Console log data. And now we've got our array with a bunch of objects on the inside. If we pop it open, we'll see that they've all been numbered for us. And they've got all of the different teams on the inside. So pretty sweet. We've got our city, conference name, all that good stuff. So what we're going to be looking for here is the full name. So the last step that we want to do is, I told you we were making reference to this variable in the set teams method here. Right now, teams is an empty array. We want to fill that array with all of this information so that we can use it down here. So how we're going to do that is we're going to set teams to data. And remember, this is the data that we're talking about here. So this data that we saw in our console down here. And remember, we want the full name. So we're going to do data dot full name. Not yet, though. Sorry, just a second. So if we have, right now, we have all of that information that we just saw actually inside of this array. And so how we can see that is, if I go inside of this unordered list, I open up some curly braces and I say teams dot map, and I'm going to map through all of those teams in that array of objects. So I'll call it team, and what I'm going to return is a list item with the team dot full name, and these should be inside of curly braces. And now there are all of our teams, and I'm getting an error about a unique key. Here what we can do is we can say key equals team dot full name, because that should be unique since it's the NBA and no two teams should have the same exact name. You always want to make sure that your keys are something unique. Stay away from using an index because your data could change and things could get re-indexed and moved around, and that could kind of mess up what you're working with. So just make sure that that key is unique. But now we can see that all of those teams have populated onto the page, and we no longer have to hard code. If we did it the other way, we'd have 30 LIs that we would have to manually update each time. And so the good thing is now anytime that Ball Don't Lie API updates, we'll be able to pull those changes whenever this component mounts onto a page. So that's been a little bit of a tutorial on how to use the Fetch API in a useEffect hook to pull some data from a public API. So hope you found this helpful. If you did, go ahead and give the video a like and subscribe. Be putting out some more videos soon. Until next time, have a good one.